Okay, the link to this room is in the chat. It's that first one I just sent. Put that on the website. Cool. Okay, welcome. This is the third installment of Cogtuito. This is the first part of a two-part series called This Would Unironically Philosophical Hot Takes. We're really excited to see so many people here, especially familiar faces. Welcome back. Oh, I'm hearing myself. How's that happening? Oh, YouTube. I see. It's never nice to hear yourself anyway, but like if it comes as a surprise, it's even worse. Okay, so so I'm Jen Foster. I'm one of the co-founders of the Cogtuito series. Cassie.
Hi, I'm Cassie. I am also hearing two of me. Do you hear two of me?
Do you have the YouTube link open?
Maybe. Real quick. Hi, I'm Cassie. I'm also a co-founder. Hello.
Um, so yeah, we'd like to welcome you. We would also like to thank our handful of sponsors.
Like, well,
for keeping us afloat.
you know, before we were just like, maybe this was biased.
Oh, that was Audrey. So if you're interested in
good,
I might simply say to her, please stop right.
If you're interested in sponsoring the Cogtuito, or your organization is, you can do so on the website, and hopefully we can keep doing these. Did we want? Oh yeah, and we wanted to say a little bit just to remind everybody how it works, especially if you're new, even though we are seeing a lot of familiar faces today. So we're going to start with the APA style talks. Those are going to be 25-minute presentations followed by comments from an invited commentator, a brief response period from the speaker, and then Q&A. Those are going to start in about 5 minutes. We'll have E.C. Hamilton's talk in this room and Mason Westfall's talk in Zoom Room B, which is the one Cassie is hosting, but AG is chairing. Then at 10:30, we'll reconvene. In the interim between those two periods, this room will stay open for chatting and hanging out. You're welcome to kind of float in and out throughout the day, but especially during those interim periods. If speakers want to continue the Q&A, it often spills over into that period, but we want to make sure that the speakers know that they're not under any obligation to keep talking about their stuff once their time is up. 10:30, the coffee hour talks will start. Those are going to be hour-long, just sort of informal conversations. The speaker will spend a couple of minutes identifying sort of main idea that they want to talk about, and then sort of workshop the idea with the participants over the next hour. We'll have another sort of break. Again, this room will stay open. And then at 1, we'll have our colloquium talk, So there's 1 colloquium talk, 3 coffee hours, 2 APA styles. Okay. Yeah, it'll be on YouTube. Follow us on Twitter at Cogtuito Series for the YouTube links as we're going along. The website will also have them updated. And Cassie, did you want to say? Did we have anything else to say?
Hi, Julia.
Okay, so let's see. Cassie, would you mind putting the Zoom Room B link in the chat? Just cool. So for those who are planning to attend UC Hamilton's talk, that will be again in this room. If you're planning to attend Mason's talk, that will be you can follow this link that Cassie's going to provide. And I hope you guys have a great time. Hopefully we're going to have some fun today. And maybe hear some hot takes. Not too spicy, I hope. Oh yeah, I should make Cassie a co-host. Okay, so Zoombi, yeah, is in the chat. It should also be in your list. If you are on the email list, you should have received. Thankfully, you got here, so presumably you have that. So that's also on that list. For Zoombi is on that list.
All right. Am I good to start screen sharing or?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
And give you a brief introduction just right at 8:30. But yeah, go ahead. Oh, I should. Do you have permission to do that?
I do not have permission. I just clicked on the button and it yelled at me.
Did that work this time? Okay.
How tight are we for time, by the way? Like if I go a couple minutes over, am I dominoing the rest of the?
No.
Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, what you might do is like domino your like Q&A period. So, but we are we've built in these like big chunks of time. So hopefully, we don't. I mean, I think it would be extremely unlikely to domino into the rest. But it's totally up to you in terms of like how long you want to keep talking.
Sure.
After the Q&A period is done.
All right. Is the presentation up? Okay.
Yep, that's great. I love that. Okay, first of all, I need to figure out how to turn that off so you guys stop hearing my text messages from Cassie. Okie dokie. So yeah, welcome to our first APA talk. I'm very pleased to introduce UC Hamilton of Concordia University. She's going to be presenting her paper, Putting the Judge in Prejudice, Neutralizing Anti-Discrimination Efforts Through Mischaracterizing the Motives for Prejudice. And then we'll have comments from Audrey Yap from University of Victoria. Go ahead whenever you're ready.
Oh, hang on. I have to. Am I unmuted right now? Okay. Okay, perfect. All right, we'll go back in then. All right. Okay, just quickly, we'll have chat in Laura right here. Okay. Oh, there we go. Oh, I didn't realize it was going to animate. Sorry, people. So this paper is putting the judge in prejudice, neutralizing anti-discrimination efforts through mischaracterizing the motives for prejudice. I have oh my gosh, it's going to do this the hard way. All right, sorry about that, folks. I didn't realize it was going to do that. So our overview, I'm going to briefly introduce myself. I'll go over the content notices because we are talking about prejudice. So we're going to talk about some pretty gnarly stuff today. We'll quickly review the core question, and then we'll go over some of the conventional views of prejudice and their causes and sources. I have to rush through the fourth section here a little bit just to stay on time. So unfortunately, I won't be able to really give a deep review or like a comprehensive review of feminist literature on objectification. So I'll be trying to rush through that. I forgot to set my timer as well, just to make sure I'm keeping time. Let me get that going. There we go. Okay. Then we'll go over sexism as a crude moral philosophy, which was Kate Mann's work in Down Girl back in, I want to say, was that 2019, I believe. And then we finally go to the last piece, which is the synthesis, taking the pieces from Kate Mann's philosophy that seems to work and applying them to cissexism and transphobia. And then we'll finish off with future investigations. So what are the things that basically hit the cutting room floor because I don't have enough time? Okay, I'm E.C. Hamilton, she, her. I've also published under Siobhan O'Leary in investigative journalism. I'm an undergraduate at the School of Community and Public Affairs in Concordia University, and I like to unironically call myself a cissexual studies scholar. All right, our content notices. We are reviewing sexism and misogyny, obviously. We're going to be talking, not graphically, but we will be talking about domestic violence. We'll be talking about the sort of entitled attitudes that are exhibited in hegemonic masculinities. We'll be obviously reviewing cissexism and transphobia, retaliatory sexual violence, and cissexist victim blaming. And then the last piece is just discriminatory tactics. So stuff like the dehumanization, objectification, psychological abuse. There's never going to be anything graphic in this, but nonetheless, I will understand if you have to excuse yourself to make sure that you're okay during the presentation. So that won't hurt my feelings. All right, so these are the questions we want to keep at the front of our mind as we go through the presentation. We want to learn a little bit about what actually is prejudice. We want to talk a little bit about why do people do it? And then the last piece is, why am I proposing this sort of like moral duty description of prejudice as opposed to the other models? So we're going to start off with the feminist tradition of objectification, just as a particular example of prejudice. In the paper, I have a section on the scope where I say that I'm gonna refrain from making any comments about racism specifically. So if at any point during the presentation you think, would this be applicable for racism, for example, I'm going to refrain from answering that just because it's outside of my domain, and I haven't yet encountered any like racial justice scholars basically that have commented on Kate Mann's model. So if you're like, does this apply to racism? Great question. I'll refrain from making assumptions. So this is sort of a 5-sentence breakdown of like the work of like Andrea Dworkin, Sally Haslinger, and Catherine McKinnon, which is, what do we mean by an object in the feminist tradition? So the first point is a claim that objects have a certain nature that can be determined by observation. A user goes to use this object. The user comes to believe that the object has the property of being usable through observing their use of it. Points 1 through 3 here are all fairly logical. There's nothing that hazardous. Point 4 is where it starts to get a little bit problematic if we're talking about people, obviously. The conclusion is naturally that the object's nature is to be used. So everything we just walked through, this whole concept of, what is an object? It's something that I can use because it has the nature of being usable. Probably unproblematic if I'm riding my bike. Very different ethical dimensions if we're talking about people. So here's Sally Haslinger. We have a quote at the top here. She says, "These reflections suggest that what appeared to be a neutral or objective ideal namely the procedure of drawing on observed regularities to set constraints on practical decision-making, is one which will, under certain conditions of gender hierarchy, reinforce the social arrangements on which such hierarchy depends. So what is she actually talking about here? She's saying that perpetrators of sexist harm probably justify it to themselves by asserting or believing that women possess the nature that permits the offending behavior. So when we're talking about objectification, we aren't saying that someone is inanimate. Obviously, that's a bad faith misreading of feminist literature. Hassinger is saying that, you know, the reason these behaviors occur is because the people that do the behavior believe that there's something about women who have the nature that makes this thing morally permissible. So this sort of view is saying that sexism is, quote unquote, like caused by this belief system. And then we're looking at dehumanization, which is another component of the conventional view of prejudice. So we have at the top here, an aggressor perpetrated violence because they believed their victim to be less than human. We see this a lot in genocidal studies. If you have the heart to read it, dehumanization comes up a lot, and there's a handful of scholars that will actually point to it as the cause of the genocide. So the logic works a little bit like this. We owe moral consideration to humans. We do not owe moral consideration to non-humans. The object was non-human, or at least less human. Therefore, I didn't owe the object moral consideration. Again, all of this is potentially fine reasoning. There's nothing inherently wrong. Let me rephrase that, actually. There are a few points you could object to here. But for example, if I squish an ant on the sidewalk, it would be hard pressed to find someone who would condemn me on a moral basis for doing that, because we don't typically most of us don't think we owe ants moral consideration. So this is just a conversation about like the boundary as to who is a member of the moral community, who is worth moral consideration. The idea being that dehumanization is a maneuver in this literature. It's saying dehumanization is a maneuver to say that someone is not worth moral consideration, which then explains why the violence occurs. And so once again, just going back to the feminist tradition, we have Andrea Dworkin talking about objectification. She says here, it is an injury right at the heart of discrimination. Those who can be used as if they are not fully human are no longer fully human in social terms. Their humanity is hurt by being diminished. So we're seeing that connection with this idea that specifically sexist prejudice occurs because somebody isn't being viewed as a full human in Dworkin's view, which then permits the use behavior that we see from the earlier logic about objectification. And then just really quick, I'm just gonna like blaze through some like really high level, like what else have people said about prejudice? We've got stuff like it's a conformity thing, it's a dislike of deviancy, aversion to ambiguity, valuing conformity. All of these are kind of saying like roughly the same thing about prejudice, that it's rooted in a attention that's paid to something unusual, basically. So those are some of the conventional views of prejudice. So just roughly speaking, I'm going to go over, again, I'm pressed for time, so I can't like do the deep dive that I want to do, but in a nutshell, the problems with our previous cases that we've had made is that we are talking about what an interlocutor believes. So philosophically, this interlocutor has a very strong claim as to their true motives. It's very, very difficult to prove someone decisively wrong about their motives. And sometimes it may even be unethical to attempt to do so. What I'm getting at there is that there's, if you haven't read about it already, there's a phenomenon called first-person authority, which is certain types of knowledge claims are privileged in the sense that only the knower can decisively prove it. So the classic example is, I'm in pain, right? You cannot specifically prove the statement, I'm in pain, but I certainly know that it's true. So when I talk about how it's potentially unethical to argue about what someone's true motives are, I'm referring to first-person authority when we're talking about certain types of knowledge claims where it's morally hazardous territory to dispute that. We do know that self-convoluting is something that happens, obviously. If you've ever been to a good psychologist, you know that they can help you disentangle your own self-convolution. But critically, that kind of interaction occurs in an agreed upon setting. So if somebody were to try and like psychoanalyze me right now, I would tell them to screw off. Our second philosophical problem is that interlocutors rarely, if ever, agree that their motives have been described correctly. And the example I give here is the forced birth objection to the claim that they hate women. They often reply with that they, quote, care about the child. And so I don't have any reason to say that this is a bad faith description of a what I'm calling a forced birth position. It's hard to argue that someone's doing it in bad faith. It can be done, but it's hard. And then practical limitations, practical problems with the previous models. We're spending a lot of time debating attitudes of interlocutors. And again, I come out and say they're unwinnable. They're not unwinnable. They're going to suck a lot of time, and they're very, very difficult. So our ability to organize a response to this solution is going to be disrupted if we can't actually name the problem, if we just spend the whole time arguing about whether or not somebody really hated women, for example. Our second point, we have moments of like the sexist aggressive outbursts, or what I'm describing in the second point here. They're not really well described by this very cerebral or theoretical exercise. So aggressors probably aren't thinking about women's natures in the moment they act. A brief point on that, a lot of the rationalization system of sexism probably is consumed by aggressors before the moment of explosive aggression. So they've certainly been exposed to it, and it's helped to recruit them into the entitlement narrative that we'll talk a little bit later. But that's not really the sort of like cerebral thing about like, you know, what is women's nature is not something that's typically going to be at the foreground of somebody in the moment that they are doing some kind of explosive sexist aggression. So if someone values sexism, this is my last point, they might actually want to draw our focus on these unwinnable debates. They want us to be talking over and over and over again about whether or not they quote unquote really hate women. Because it's going to be drawing energy away from actually naming and countering the problem. All right, so that was all of the conventional stuff in 10 minutes. We're going to go over Kate Mann here, sexism as duty. So she's proposing something else instead. I'm going to cut through some of this. We have the first sentence. There's a common assumption on the left that the right seeks to punish women for having sex outside of marriage, and that abortion is therefore largely a matter of policing women's bodies and controlling their sexuality. Doubtless these motives are part of the mix, but if that was all there was to it, why prohibit access to abortion for women who are victims of rape and incest? Yet this remains a commonly endorsed prohibition. And she reviews the claims that are made in defense of that position, and she finishes with, there's a puzzle. What are women held to be guilty of doing or being? Withholding and failing to give, I think, being callous, cold, heartless, neglecting their natural duty to provide safe haven and nurture by evicting a vulnerable being from their home, yada, yada, yada. So this isn't Mann's philosophy. She's paraphrasing what she's calling the sexist position. And she's trying to make the case that sexism is representing a rationalization system that leads people to ethical conclusions. And the specific types of ethical conclusions she's talking about is a moral debt that is owed by women to men. And then misogyny, she asks us to consider misogyny sorry, let me rephrase that. She asks us to distinguish from sexism and misogyny by saying that misogyny is a tactic. Tactic is something that's done to enforce the prior moral belief. And so we've got this, in the actual text, she's quoting studies that are supporting this idea that women need to be twice as good as men in order to achieve the same things. But then she says the fact that there might be a competent woman might not actually damage a sexist position. A sexist could observe a competent woman and they can be taken aback, and then because they have this idea of, you know, what women are supposed to be, they encounter it, they're confused, and they unwittingly engage in this sort of like post hoc rationalization to make sense of their feelings of suspicion. And so what Mann is actually saying here is that women aren't being dehumanized in misogyny. They're being positioned as human, but what's happening when she's describing misogynist tactics is that they are being punished because they have chosen, from the perspective of the sexist, they have chosen to neglect this moral duty that was held before. So that's kind of what she's talking about. She's trying to distinguish between sexism and misogyny. Sexism is the rationalization that leads someone to conclude that that women have this moral duty to men. And then misogyny is all of the actions they take to enforce that moral belief. And her particular example here with the competent woman is an example of how hatred just isn't really an adequate explanation for it. So she noted that law writing work has a distinct character for moments of sexist aggression. Women find themselves held back both by people purporting to merely be reasonable about their natures, as we discussed earlier, as well as people who try to force the issue of adhering to said nature with aggression. If it really was natural, why does it need to be enforced? If that's the question that popped into your head, congratulations. Welcome to feminist philosophy. Mann asks us to make, this is the distinction she's asking us to make, just briefly reviewing. Sexism is the system of rationalizations that men are owed certain goods. So the two pieces we need are rationalizations and owed certain moral goods. And then for misogyny, it's all of the tactics that are used by belief holders to enforce their beliefs. So those are the four pieces we want to hold on to. We have a rationalization for owing a moral good, and then a tactic to enforce that moral good. So one of the main benefits of this particular moral duty model is that because this sexism is concerning itself with rationalizations, we're looking at the arguments that people actually make and the beliefs that they actually avow. So we don't have to try and like interrogate what the true motive is. We can just accept sexist claims on their face and still analyze them and still sort of evaluate them morally. And the other advantage is that although they probably would not call it sexism, they typically will agree that their beliefs have been accurately described. They'll typically call it something like natural law. And I wrote this like, I wrote this like 2 weeks before that tweet went viral of the fascist guy who was like, it's not white supremacy, it's natural law, right? Like, so that was a happy coincidence. I didn't actually encounter that until after I had written this slide. Other strengths for this type of misogyny, so that was sexism, this is misogyny. We're looking at observed behavior. And again, we're not looking at the motives. We now have specific behaviors we can detect and organize against. And the last piece is just also that like it more plausibly describes aggression against women with this like entitled, being spurred in entitlement seems to more accurately describe what's going on in a person's head in the moment that they engage in sexist aggression. I don't think I've got enough time to really go over her example. Yeah, I won't go through it. So her last sentence here, if hatred of women is such a rare, or sorry, this is my sentence. if hatred of women is such a rare, genuine motive that a mass murderer can't have been said to do it, then no one could ever truly hate women and quote unquote be a misogynist in this construct. She's very briefly talking about how the murderer in the Isla Vista killings, there was a lot of resistance, especially in the media, about saying that, basically making the claim that he didn't hate women when he carried out his murders. And Mann sort of dissecting that like all of this preoccupation is setting such a high bar that we would never meet it. And then very briefly, just to further reinforce that this might be a plausible model, if we're at a restaurant and our server asks us to take their order, we've got a couple things that are happening, right? We're confused because our expectations have been defied. If you wanted to do it philosophically, you might say, well, my transaction implies an agreement and that agreement's being subverted, right? That's a very sort of, you can open that up into different philosophical steps. which does to me suggest that like the reason we have that reaction is that we have this structure around who is owed what. The second point is, if this did happen, are we likely to actually conclude from this interaction that all servers, all of them everywhere, are unsuitable, not members of the moral community? Probably not. We're probably just going to say this particular server is very weird. So we don't need hatred as a motive to explain our reaction. And what I'm getting at is that that's exactly the situation for it, at the very least, sexism and cissexism. So this is it. This is the moral duty model, and now we're applying it to cissexism, excuse me. So this is my claim. There is a perceived duty that one illustrate their birth sex by way of easily understood norms in appearance and mannerism. This is the claim I'm fundamentally advancing with this model. And so to sort of expose this, we need to look at a transmisogynist murder. Talia Mae Betcher analyzed a murder case where a trans woman was killed by her lover after she was exposed as a trans woman. And there was a media furor, of course, because there always is. And the comment that occurs to people is, why did she lie? Why did she lie about who she was? And so this is a very puzzling claim, because the question I have here in point 2 is, how can one lie if you haven't answered a question that was never asked? Right? Nobody actually asked her. This, all of this violence occurred without anybody actually like establishing like, hey, what was your birth sex? Nobody actually asked. So how is she lying if, what kind of exposure can occur? So the answer is our clue. This is where it's like cissexism, excuse me, is located. The idea is it was asked. It was asked and it was answered with one's appearance. So the only way that this idea that a trans woman can be lying with her appearance, the only way it can make sense is if the person who makes this accusation thinks that your appearance is supposed to correlate with some norms about your birth sex. It's the only way this can really be explained. And the reason I want to emphasize that is because in this particular murder case that Talia Mae Betcher is analyzing, the murderer actually knew his victim was trans well in advance of the actual murder. And what had happened was, because she was exposed by his friends, he tried to save face by murdering her and claiming he was tricked, but that was false. Okay, yeah. So just to keep on time, these are all of the attitudes that I've talked about. I kind of just went over them, so I'll just zoom through the slide here. So once again, we have the same strengths. We don't need our interlocutors to agree that they hate trans people. I've never had that happen, so carries all the same strengths with Kate Mann's model. So now we're actually looking at like, what does this look like? So a misogynistic tactic to enforce sexism might be something as like, we're going to talk about misogyny as a hatred of all women, setting an impossible standard to prove. We can accuse women of being suspect for being for exhibiting morally permissible behavior as seen in men. We can also warp women's advocacy to represent something else. So I gave the earlier example of objectification, talking about making the claim that women are viewed as inanimate objects, which is a completely ridiculous misreading of what they wrote. So then applying the same thing, exact same tactics to protect cissexism, excuse me. We can mischaracterize transphobia as a hatred of all trans people, excuse me. We can accuse a trans person of being suspect for exhibiting morally permissible behavior seen as ordinary in cis people, like, I don't know, going outside and wearing clothes that you want to. And then the last piece is, of course, warping trans people's self-advocacy to represent something else. And I just have 3 examples here from J.K. Rowling's, I guess I'll say infamous article. She has at the top, oh, it's ridiculous. They'll say I hate trans people, right? The idea of the paragraph is that it's ridiculous to make the accusation. And I do think it's wrong. I do think it's inaccurate to say that she hates trans people. There's suspicion for ordinary behavior. So here Rowling is trying to pathologize the use of hashtags, which is something a lot of people do on Twitter anyways. She's also misquoting Simone de Beauvoir, who probably would not have supported her, because of course de Beauvoir also famously wrote that one is not born a woman, one becomes one. And then the last piece is we see her mischaracterizing self-advocacy. So she has this, the way she's written this next sentence when she's talking about women have said before me, woman is not a costume, it's not an idea in a man's head. She's positioning this as the view of trans people in general. And okay, I can find like a website from 1997 that talks about it's important to wear, you know, or that makes the like pink brain claim, and that you have to like, you know, present yourself in a certain way. That I did locate that kind of claim, but it's from like a website that hasn't been updated since 1997. Like this is not a very widely held view. So these are just all of the evidence of the tactics that I was talking about. So our key points as I come up on my 25 minutes here. I do want to caution that all of the strong emotive responses that come up when we're studying prejudice, they do occur. And I even think that objectification has correctly diagnosed, excuse me. Yeah. So all of the strong emotive responses, so dehumanization, objectification, hatred, these are things that occur. But what I'm saying is that the causation is reversed, right? It's the prejudice system has to exist, and it is the cause. It's the prejudice system that is the cause of the strong responses. I worry that a lot of both the popular positions as well as the literature that says dehumanization is the cause, for example, has actually got it backwards. My second key point is that preoccupation with interlocutors' attitudes may itself be an expression of prejudice, at least in the cases of sexism and cissexism. Again, I'm being cautious about making claims about other types of prejudice. And then the last piece, which was the broadside against, I guess, like the D&I industry, which I have many respected colleagues, and I love the work that they try to do. But I do think that if I'm onto something, and if man is onto something, it's actually inappropriate to stop at mere fact checking when we're looking at it at an instance of prejudice. Mostly because if this is a morality system, then the thing that has to be responded to would be moral education. And then the sort of what hit the cutting room floor, could a moral education reduce this propensity for prejudice? I very briefly mentioned it in my actual paper. I don't know if I'm ready to defend this claim yet because it was just like a throwaway line, but like, you know, if somebody can properly apply the Rawlsian veil of ignorance, for example, they might be able to sort of detect the very harsh unfairness that's produced through prejudice. And so that suggests to me that moral education might be a good way to look at this. Oh, excuse me. A second point I found was there's some recent work on a phenomenon called morally networked harassment. And I haven't yet like looked into it, but might that affect some of my conclusions? That's kind of my next stop on this particular investigation. And I think I'm only 2 minutes over. All right. Do we still have our host?
Thank you so much, EC. Please join me in thanking EC for that presentation. You can following Nikki, use the clap emoji, which by the way, for the rest of the day is in the reactions section of your Zoom window. So wonderful. Now we're gonna have some comments from Audrey Yap.
Okay, I have no slides because that's just how it goes. Okay, so super like this paper. I think, so this is a great paper. It makes a super solid case that a kind of naive conception of transphobia is just as unhelpful as the naive conception of misogyny, right? I mean, so misogynists probably have at least one woman in their life that they, don't literally hate. at least plenty of people who say lots of transphobic stuff, like, I have a trans friend. Sometimes the trans friend is hypothetical. Seems like the, right? Like the trans person who's just trying to go about their life, I guess, never encountering any cis people. I'm not sure, but there is at least always that defense. And so there are plenty of good grounds to kind of reject this characterization of transphobia as basically just hatred of trans folks. So, I mean, really, that's just to say, like, nothing I'm going to say in my comments is going to be like, oh, I disagree or anything like that. It's mainly just in the spirit of kind of additions or suggestions, things like that. Since dehumanization came up, I think just a super brief note, I actually think it is a really good explanation for lots of things that happen in cases of like racist genocide. But I just wanted to put a plug in for a kind of idea or a concept that comes out of like sort of ethics of captivity, critical, like intersections between critical animal studies and critical prison studies, and which is de-animalization, which just kind of affirms that like, actually non-human animals shouldn't be treated like crap either. So that's kind of neither here nor there. I think dehumanization is good for some stuff, but like nothing you said implied that it was never the case of that dehumanization was never what's actually going on.
Yeah. That's a good point that I missed on the future investigations. It was something I thought of when I was doing my research that actually I almost fell into that trap because I said earlier when I was talking about who we owe moral considerations to, I almost just uncritically accepted, I think it was point 3 or whatever, the point that we don't owe moral consideration to non-humans. And I was like, wait, no, hang on. There are debates around that one too. So I had to stop myself. Yeah. But yeah, that's definitely a like related
totally. And my non-humans may Zoom bomb this talk at any moment, so they might weigh in on this subject too. Awesome. So actually, one thing though, so like the actual comments that I had before I just jotted down that note is I actually think there's some elements of Mann's newer book, so her entitlement book, that are actually like maybe even friendlier to some of the kinds of analysis that you want to give. And I mean, I don't think the conceptual framework in Entitled is really that different from the conceptual framework in Down Girl, but it focuses more on the kind of issue of the sort of rationalization aspect, or like, what are men entitled to? So it focuses on men's entitlement to like power, status, women's attention, and then the ways that women will say tend to pay the price for that entitlement if men don't get those kinds of goods. And actually, I think Jonathan made that point, like made a kind of similar point in the chat. I think the entitlement account is really good at making sense of a lot of racist backlash as well. So like lots of white folks don't want their entitlements challenged. So as soon as you kind of put it in those terms, there you get like moral panic about critical race theory and, you know, telling my little white children that they didn't actually deserve the privileges that they have. So I think challenges to entitlement are a good way of explaining some of the kinds of backlash that I think you have in mind. So that's awesome.
Okay.
Oh yeah, I think Ijeoma Oluo does this in Mediocre as well, with like more of a focus on gender and race. So
perfect. That's going to be a good one. That was Oluo?
Yeah.
Okay. Whoa. And what was the book again?
Mediocre.
Mediocre. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so actually I'm going to talk a little bit about a part of the paper that you discussed. I might end up putting it in slightly different terms that I think are still friendly.
You don't, I'm a retired journalist, so I've been, I've had very harsh feedback before. Well, so there shouldn't be any risk of. All
right, I'm not a yeller, so okay. Well, actually sometimes I am, but not in these kinds of cases. Okay, so here when we're kind of so now we're turning the lens of entitlement on like a really particular brand of cis nonsense. So it's exactly the kind of thing that Better is pointing to when she's talking about like, so gendered clothing has this kind of paradoxical function, right? So our clothing is at minimum supposed to cover up our genitals, but also signal what kinds of genitals we have. And that's kind of weird when you think about it. But here, I think there's a kind of interesting asymmetry, and I don't know what to do with it, but I thought I'd sort of offer it up. So because, you know, how that tends to work is, I think that it's often portrayed as like, we, just in general, there's like a we who are entitled to know, you know, what kinds of genitals you have and do they match what I don't know, somehow, like that seems to be the kind of problem with lots of trans folks just existing in spaces, right? We're entitled to that knowledge. Even if we don't intend to do anything with those genitals, like that involves those genitals in any way, there's somehow this entitlement to knowledge about, you know, what are they? And so what happened, and so then I think how that plays out is in cis sexism, right? That knowledge is, you know, in theory, because of this kind of function that clothing is supposed to have, it's kind of demanded of everybody. But it's the trans folks who are most at risk of being seen as failing to provide that information. So it's kind of like an entitlement or an obligation that, you know, clothing is somehow, or this kind of social function of clothing is imposing on everyone. But it's mainly just going to be the trans folks, or sometimes maybe just some gender non-conforming folks, who are going to be accused of not providing that good. Whereas I think in a lot of cases of gendered entitlement, like the ones that Man is talking about, it's not an entitlement. It's not something that everyone is entitled to. It's something that men are entitled to, and then women are supposed to give it. So I think, I don't know if there's something to that asymmetry, but I think it's interesting anyway to note some of the asymmetries between the ways that this kind of entitlement or rationalization plays out in the cases of cis sexism versus sexism. So like how the structure of those entitlements work. So
yeah, no, I
thought about.
I think you've absolutely correctly described the contrast there. Basically, I don't think you were doing this to like be critical, but what I'll explain, I guess, for everybody else is that it's okay if cis sexism doesn't perfectly resemble sexism, because it's not actually the same. Like, it's not actually the same logic, right? So like Audrey has absolutely, or she's absolutely described my position correctly, in the sense that I do think that cis sexism is a system that is frequently expected of everyone, right? That the cis sexist expects this to be upheld by everyone. I suppose the only thing I would change would be the people who are at risk of sort of violating this expectation. It can kind of be all over the map, right? There's even, and I do have to like figure out more about like what this might mean for the research, but I can think of examples where like people are really cruel to cisgendered men, for example, who even exhibit like basic emotional intelligence, because that's not viewed as a masculine trait, which is, holy crap, what a big source of our problems. That to me kind of teases a little bit as well to the existence of this like entitlement framework. So I would agree. Yeah, actually, you did phrase it. You said trans people are just at the highest risk of. Okay, now that I remember, when I'm recalling your words, you did catch that.
No worries. Okay, so last kind of, I think maybe this is the last kind of thing that I just wanted to sort of offer up, which is like I think putting transphobia side by side with misogyny is a super illuminating analogy, and one of the I think cool things that can come out of this as well are just some ideas about the relationship between transphobia and misogyny, where I think sometimes, so I think I tend to describe so sexism, for example, in Man's framework as more of an ideology than a rationalization. And this is partly because I sort of take ideologies to be a little bit more flexible in their consequences than rationalizations. So I think that's the only reason why I sort of pick slightly different terminology. So here's why, right? Because I think probably lots of us who are listening here, right? We know that transphobia and misogyny are not really cleanly separable. I mean, of course, this is why there's a concept of transmisogyny, but like, even for reasons beyond just intersectionality, I think there's good reasons not to separate them cleanly. So what I'm thinking about there is I'm thinking about the ways that transphobia actually will also just amount to things like naturalizing women's weakness and controlling women's movement throughout the world. And that actually seems to be a kind of background ideology that's going to feed into both transphobia and misogyny and transmisogyny and a whole range of other things, right? So like transphobia portraying trans women in particular as somehow subject to dangerous tendencies because of some kind of biological factors, right? Like that, you know, I mean, as I know lots of people have pointed out, right? That's just like naturalizes men acting in violent ways. Like if it's inevitable, it's just like biology. Like that's not that different from a kind of boys will be boys kind of justification for violence.
Mhm.
Right. So if it's somehow inevitable that anyone assigned male at birth is prone to violence, like that is bad for all kinds of people. And actually seems to be also straightforward misogyny. So I think even though some of the enforcement mechanisms that are really aimed at trans women and controlling trans women's movement throughout the world, I think that when we look at it as a background ideology, and this is totally a strength of your view, but also a kind of helpful point of connection, I think it's not separable from the background ideology that controls all kinds of women's movement throughout the world, right? Like the world is filled with men. I mean, plenty of like feminist philosophers have kind of, you know, like they've referred to this as like the protection racket, right? We need protection from men, perhaps by other men, or like we need to be segregated in our own social spaces, like, you know, our own, like whatever, as though that's our sex-based right or something, whatever they're saying these days. And so I think that, yeah, like that's, I think one of the interesting things about taking a step back and looking at the ideology as well as the actions, because then you might see how certain kinds of background ideologies can feed into a whole bunch of different actions, right? Because, hey, like upshot, ideologies are messy. Law enforcement mechanisms, they're messy. So like a lot of them, you know, biological determinism is bad for all kinds of us, like racist, misogynist, transphobic, ableist, all kinds of things, right? So that's just also maybe adding in there too, right? Like a helpful angle to take. So,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thanks. Definitely areas to follow up.
Yeah, but that's mainly what I wanted to say. So I'll make sure I leave time for other people to ask questions too.
Perfect. And yes, I think that does get us to segue to Q&A. Oh, were there any sent in chat? Maybe I can stop sharing real quick. Or no, that's how I view chat. Okay.
Yeah, so awesome. Thank you so much, Audrey, for those comments. And yeah, let's open it up for Q&A. We've got about a little under 15 minutes. Sorry, a little over 15 minutes. I can't add, especially live on YouTube. So if you have a question, please use the raise hand function. Again, you can find that by going to reactions down in your bottom bar and pressing raise hand. And we'll get started. Okay, Miara, I hope that's right. You were first.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. It's really great and really enlightening.
Oh, actually, one second. EC, do you mind to stop sharing just so we can see everybody's face? Awesome.
Okay, okay, so I have a couple questions. First question is, when we talk about a notion of biological determinism, it's not clear to me if we know what we're talking about, what the referent is when we say the word biology. That's one question I have. Second one is, I know you said you're kind of intentionally not bringing in race into this, but I couldn't help but think about how it relates, so sexism and sexism and racism, how they relate, especially with the example of the Isla Vista killings, which was perpetuated by a half Asian and half white man who strongly identify with their British heritage and not at all with their Asian heritage, if you actually read that manifesto. So I was thinking about the example of where in Atlanta, Korean women, massage workers, were killed by a white person who also explicitly espoused sexist ideologies, such as the woman owing them sexual favors and so on. So I'm curious how thinking of that example changes that analysis a little bit. The last question I had, what was the last question? I had one.
Well, if you wanted EC to just respond to those first ones, and then we can come back.
I can start with the first two for sure. So for biology, let's see if I can do this in like 2 sentences. So biology is actually packaging, is a label that packages 2 different things. And this is true for basically any empirical discipline. You have, on one hand, like the empirical physical observations. So when we're talking about biological determinism, stuff that's like can't actually be disputed. This would be examples of like, if you did karyotype me, for example, most likely, I haven't actually been karyotyped. That's when they draw out your chromosomes and put it in the little gel thing and yada, yada, yada. If you did karyotype me, I'm probably, it's always a chance, probably, you would probably find XY chromosomes, for example. So that's an empirical observation. But the thing we call biology is also a set of stories that we tell to make sense of the empirical observations, right? When I go outside, for example, and I go to a public place, there's no XY bathroom. There's a men's bathroom and a women's bathroom. So that's an example of how there's the thing we call quote unquote biology is empirical observations, which I don't dispute, versus the significance we give to those observations. So when we talk about biological determinism, the determinism is the significance that's being paired on top of the observation, basically. So that would be nonsense claims about how like if somebody made the nonsense claim that Asian women are like more submissive or whatever, even if even if they found some way to support this claim, it would be an instance of biological determinism to say that this was caused by their nature and not, for example, other factors that might lead to that. So that's kind of the referent. It's the combination of the empirical observation plus the story we spin to make sense of it, because our brain isn't very good at just having a long list of empirical observations, right? Our brain wants to like put things in boxes so that we can access it later. That's kind of how our psychology tends to work. So we're very, very bad at just keeping a long list of empirical observations with like no baggage at all attached to it. We're very bad at doing that. And so determinism is just kind of that's what it is. It's aggressively putting everything it can find in the caused by nature box. As to the second piece, I do actually think like racism might be explainable by this model. The main reason I wanted to be cautious at this point is because I haven't actually done that research. I don't actually have any scholars of color that I can quote on this and point to it and say, they've made these observations that line up with these ones. I'm really glad to hear some people concurring that it could be related, but mostly at this point, it's just me being cautious because I haven't actually done that work yet. And that's the reason I was kind of like holding back from like claiming, yes, this explains all prejudice. The other one was ableism. I very much like Fiona Campbell's description of narcissistic ableism. And I think Campbell's model explains a lot of ableism. So I'm also kind of like investigating how much of this prejudice system would apply to that. Because I think ableism is driven a lot more by like fear of becoming disabled, or like eugenic ideologies, eugenic commitments. So I'm still kind of like hashing out how much of this might be applicable to ableism specifically.
Okay. I actually remember my last question, if I may. So you mentioned a moral education to prevent these things from happening. So I'm curious what you have in mind, especially in the context of some revelations of moral philosophers, specifically, who are engaging in very unethical sexual behaviors or defending very unethical sexual behaviors. So I'm curious what you have in mind about that.
I don't know yet. That is an excellent question. I'm still figuring it out. But it is an excellent question. It's one at the front of my mind as well. How do we fix it?
Awesome. Okay, Jonathan, you want to jump in?
Sure, yeah, my video isn't on because I'm actually doing the dishes. But advantages of virtual conferences, I guess. So I really like this. I have a whole bunch of thoughts, but I did want to speak directly to a couple of things. So one of the things that came out of your talk was this idea of deception as justifying particular kinds of violence in order to save face. And I think in your model of prejudice, particularly in line with some of Audrey's comments, if we think about, say, what Richard Schusterman calls the somatic stylization of the body as indicating potential gender vis-a-vis the ways that we dress, the ways that we organize our bodies, the ways that we habitually move through space. And these somatic styles is connected with a broader moral or cultural order that organizes society. Then we can get to a lot of these kinds of moral education questions, right? So the problem here is that folks are defying the moral order of society by engaging in somatic habits that are not properly their own, or that they are not entitled to, which thereby gives them access to spaces, places, people, relationships that they should not have, and thus they need to be punished back into alignment with the broader moral, habits, right? And this, I think, plays very nicely with some of the open questions that Audrey raised, and to your question about moral education, because if we're going to be really, say, Deweyan or Confucian or Buddhist about this, our moral habit or our moral character is disclosed through actions. So therefore, most education is moral education. So what you're really talking about here is transforming the ways that we educate people to, say, transact with one another in society. But that's just my, here's a helpful thing that you could do. And if you wanted to work on this in with regards to racism and so on and so forth, Helen Nago's the habits of racist and sexist ideology, I think, is the book, because it does some of that work. But my actual question is, with regards to this model of objectification as or treating objectification as the primary, as reversing the order of discrimination, right? I can see a bunch of ways that this applies to race, ability, things like that. But one of the things that I wanted to ask about is how this ties in more with sexuality, particularly insofar as I see a lot of kind of transphobic discourse also as intertwined with, a lot of, say, anti-queer discourse, that is appropriate ways that one express sexuality, or the argument that that trans folks are, I guess, inherently sexual predators, which is something you kind of address. So I wanted to hear you speak more about the ways that this structure works in the mode of sexuality, because I don't think that we can easily disentangle the issues here.
Yeah, that is actually a great question as well. And that's also on my list of like future reading for sure. What could I say at this point? I guess So just confirming, when we talk about objectification, we're talking about this logic that because something has a nature, or something, excuse me, I got that order wrong. Because we're using something, we assume it has the nature of being usable. If that's going to be our starting point for what objectification is. I'll have to reflect on it a lot more. I'm going to be cautious. I think like I could try and throw something in the wind, but I would prefer to just kind of like workshop it more intensively than I can right now before I kind of like stake my claim on that question. It's a great question though. Also another point for my future investigations is, I guess, what I'm getting at. I'm sorry I can't answer it right now, but I don't want to be talking out of my rear end without something to back me up,
Oh no, that's fine. The broader point I raise is also in alignment with issues of race, insofar as the objectification. If we're talking in the mode that you are, the objectification of women of color is grounded in how one, if not to be horribly Heideggerian, how women of color's bodies afford certain uses. I really hate that term, especially in line with the kinds of structure you're mapping out here. So I think this is yet another crucial kind of intersection that allows your work to function as a kind of general theory of prejudice with more specific manifestations that emerge in contact with other work on oppression, right? So I view your work as really valuable in sketching out a general model of prejudice that responds to our kind of current situation, but could be teased out in different directions through contact with different scholars.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll quickly emphasize that it's man was the original conceptual framework. The main thing I can lay claim to is I've applied it to cissexism and transphobia, excuse me. That's the piece that I do oh my goodness, words. I'm running out of words that I take credit for. That's the phrase I was looking for. But the framework is Dr. Kate Mann's. So
Audrey, did you have a follow-up on that?
I just had some thoughts on how EC your view could respond to Jonathan's question, which is I think to link that kind of for the sake of, or for the purpose of, I think that you were kind of thinking of, Jonathan, to the ways that I think transphobes in particular will talk about how our bodies are organized to do certain kinds of things. So that kind of idea of like the natural function of our bodies, which like is often, which is like super recycled homophobia, right? Like, oh, but like we're meant to reproduce. Like, look at you two non-reproducers going at it. I mean, yeah. Anyway, sorry. But I think that kind of idea of objectification and tools fits perfectly with the kind of transphobic rhetoric of like, your body is organized to produce large gametes, and you're like, but it doesn't, like, but it's organized to, and you're like, okay. So I think that might be the connection.
do we have time for one more? I think I saw Sam.
Yeah.
If this ends at 9:30, I can just write my question in the chat.
I mean, you're welcome to ask it, and if he wants to stick around for a couple minutes afterwards, no big deal. That's up to you.
Yeah, so I liked this. I guess I was trying to apply it to sort of work on genocide in crimes against humanity. And I guess my worry is in some of those cases, it is, you mentioned that it's only of so much importance to really care about the intent or the mindset behind the person committing the offense. And that, holds true in some cases, but in some other cases, historically courts have ruled that like intent matters. And I guess the question is, in what way does the sort of commission of an offense, of a dehumanizing offense in one field, make it such that the sort of the whether it's this sort of mindset of sort of biological determinism in one end, or whatever justifies genocide or crimes against humanity in the other. What is it about sort of the mindset that allows for culpability to be minimized in certain cases or in certain offenses of dehumanization, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think I understand. So this was actually why one of my future investigation points was about looking at morally networked harassment. So just, I've read one article so far. So admittedly, we're again wandering into territory where it's like, I might need more time to sort of workshop it a little bit. But from what I have seen so far, networked harassment is a social media phenomenon. I think you're all on Twitter because you came from Cogtweeto. So when you get quote tweeted by somebody who wants to, like, you know, do the Twitter version of taking your lunch money, they're often, what this article showed was that people know, they are aware that when they quote tweet someone, they are drawing attention to them. And they are aware that if they're doing it with a critical quote tweet, that they are likely inviting their followers to enter that person's replies. And so this phenomenon of networked harassment, it was just trying to track this idea of, you know, what causes people to do this. It very briefly, actually, sorry, the first question it actually asked is, what is it like to be on the receiving end of this? And obviously there's a spectrum. If you get quote tweeted by someone who has 1,000 followers, you might get a couple snarky replies, you block and move on. If you get quote tweeted by, I don't know, Ben Shapiro, suddenly your inbox is full of like horrible threats and you're being stalked and all of this other shit, right? Excuse me, pardon my French. So, you know, what actually happens during morally networked harassment is people are harmed, typically, often. And the harms can be quite substantial, right? Like this particular article that I'm thinking of, it showed that, like, someone basically had like PTSD and agoraphobia afterwards because of the nature of the cyber stalking that the quote tweet caused. So this is a form of harm. And the reason I wanted to start with that is we're looking at what are the attitudes that might separate why somebody does this form of harm. Almost all in this article, this was probably the most fascinating insight from it. All of the people who did this quote tweet knew that they were harming someone, and they all said it was because the person deserved it. So one of the reasons I want to look at that literature and sort of, sorry, I just saw Nikki's thing in the chat and that's funny. Oh gosh, ADHD. What was I getting at? Somebody help me with my train of thought. It was quote tweeting. They know it's an act of harm, or they often know it's an act of harm, or it can be an act of harm. Right. Okay. And then it was the attitudes of the people that did it that the person, like, they were just straightforwardly admitting this during the research, right? There didn't need to be any like carving out this whole saying like, oh, so you're trying to like work your way around the admission that they deserve it. The researchers got them to just straight up admit it during the article and just say, the reason I quote tweeted them is because I thought they deserved it. They did something wrong and I thought they deserved it. So I want to incorporate some of that research and sort of see how it affects the conclusions. My suspicion is that it probably strengthens them because people are doing this sort of like active harm, which for people who have smaller Twitters is probably like a micro, like it's not super significant if you get some snarky replies off of a quote tweet. But if you're an account like Ben Shapiro and you know that quote tweeting someone means they're going to be cyber stalked and possibly like attacked at their place of work or at their place of living, they might be swatted. Like there's this whole laundry list of harms that when your account gets big enough, you know that there's a decent chance will occur to the target of your quote tweet. So not all of these harms are just minor, right? People are justifying, major harms like swatting, which is when you call the police with a fake scenario and direct them to somebody's address so that the SWAT team kicks down their door and all that other horrible stuff. These are not small harms, and people are justifying these big harms by saying, well, they deserved it. So yeah, that's kind of my next step, is to look at that research and see if there's any weaknesses that I would want to look out for, or if I can just straight up be like, yeah, here we go. Here's an example.
Okay, well, on that note, I'd like to thank EC very much for joining us today, and Audrey for comments. Please, again, join me in putting up a round of applause. Baby.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, so EC and Audrey in particular, you are now discharged your duties to Cogito, so feel free to head out if you want to, but also feel free to stay and chat if you want to, and we'll just be hanging out in here. Mason's talk, I think, is also just now wrapping up, so people will probably start streaming back in here. We're gonna stop the YouTube stream, so if you're watching on YouTube, please make sure you keep an eye on the Cogito series Twitter feed so you can get the next round of YouTube links for the Coffee Hour Talks, which will start at 10:30 Pacific Daylight Savings Time, not PST, PDT.